Brings us to the second new Common Fund initiative. The concept is entitled Common Fund Data Ecosystem, Engaging Data Coordinating Centers. Dr. Betsy Wilder, who's the director of OSC, and Lora Kutkat, who's the senior advisor in Poughkeepsie, will present this initiative, followed by comments from two assigned council members, Kevin again and Terry. So I guess Betsy's going to start and then Lora.
Yeah, so Lora is mostly going to, sorry, Francisco, what are you? Okay. Laura is mostly going to walk you through this concept. We've been given time for, as if this is a brand new Common Fund program, but it's not really. So this is a new opportunity within an existing activity. I just want to give a little bit of context here. So this is an unusual initiative because it's not really within an existing program. What we're trying to do here is add value to many Common Fund programs. And so we've been thinking about how to do that most effectively. So the context here really is the fact that the Common Fund supports currently about a dozen large data generating efforts, and each of those has a data coordinating center attached to it. We know that this is not an entirely efficient way to support data coordination. There are redundancies in the development of these coordinating centers. There are lessons that could be learned and conveyed more effectively. But more importantly, perhaps, are the scientific lost opportunities. So we build these large data sets. There's not really currently a good way to interoperate across the data sets. And so this has been a concern. It's certainly a concern NIH-wide as well. The push to make NIH data sets findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable has been a growing concern over the past few years. And towards this end, in 2017, we, through the Common Fund, began to support a series of pilot projects that were intended to address technical challenges around making data fair. So we referred to this as the Data Commons Pilot Project, and through that endeavor, we supported a coordinating center that worked with a series of technology developers that were really thinking about technical solutions for FAIR. And also within that effort, the NIH designated 3 high-value data sets for this group of pilot projects to work with. So they were certainly involved in the effort, but they were a little bit peripheral. And Kristen probably has some strong opinions about that because GTEx was one of the data sets. But through that process, which these were year-long pilots, we did develop some pilot technologies that I think are useful, one of them being a metric for fairness of data, and some other useful lessons learned. At the end of that year, the coordinating center continued, but at the same time, the Office of Data Science Strategy was being stood up, and so the broader NIH-wide strategies have really moved to ODSS. But this allowed us an opportunity to refocus what we were trying to do with the Common Fund. And so we asked we began to refer to our efforts here as the Common Fund Data Ecosystem. And the coordinating center that we had funded, we asked them to step back and refocus in 2 ways. And one way was to really start to engage our data coordinating centers more directly to get their input about how to make data fair, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities for interoperability, how would that add value to the science, and then also what will be the standing requirements for Common Fund data sets to address sustainability issues as we move forward, what are the common challenges across data coordinating centers that we might address to add value to these. So Laura, we asked the coordinating center to develop, to think about this and develop a report, which they did in July. And Laura will tell you about that. And the concept that we're putting forward to you today emerged from this process. So it really has been quite a thoughtful endeavor to get to this point, involving a lot of people really it seems like for quite a long time. But we look forward to your comments and input. Laura.
Thank you, Betsy. So the last time you heard about the Common Fund data ecosystem, it was from Dr. Vivian Benazzi, who was here in May, to introduce what the Common Fund data ecosystem is, what it's doing, its goals, who's performing the work, and a timeline. So my goal today is to ultimately introduce you to a concept for your consideration, but provide some additional background material and in some level of detail that will help inform your deliberations. So let's see how I forward this thing. Okay. So let's revisit what is the Common Fund data ecosystem. It's an effort to advance science by making Common Fund data sets more useful alone and in combination with other Common Fund data sets. And the activities largely fall into 4 bins: infrastructure, collaboration, end user training, and sustainability. Okay, so those are the 4 main activities. But in doing so, we have roles for 3 different areas. And I'm going to describe those as the stars that have to align. And so one star that needed to align, which is moving in that direction, is the cloud environment. So the cloud environment, Google, Amazon, Azure, others, offers opportunities not only for storage and computing space, but also for sharing data more broadly beyond one specific geographic area. The second star that's aligning is the Common Fund data ecosystem, and that's the talent that's set up technical-wise, engagement-wise, to help examine the fairness attributes: findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. So that's the Common Fund data ecosystem, and that's what Vivian described in May. And this third component, and that's the star that we're going to ask you to align through our concept, involves the data. And the best way to get that data to work with this whole system, because that is the crux of all of this, is to engage the data coordinating centers. They're the experts in the data. So that's what we're going to be asking you to think through today. Okay. So when Vivian was here in May, she went through examples of why we are here, why we're asking you to look at this. And the way that data are stored and managed within NIH is pretty unique to our scientific programs. They're there to satisfy certain scientific pursuits. And less so is thought given to how that data and how those tools might be used 15, 20 years down the road. The good news, as I mentioned, and the first star that we've talked about, is that the cloud is enabling NIH programs not only for storage and computational purposes to be stuck in an environment that enables that, but it also allows that information to be shared across geographic regions. So that's the first star that is aligning due to some activities we have going on, namely STRIDES is one example of that. The other star that's aligned is the fairness principles. So, I didn't do that. Fairness principles. So just because data are in the cloud does not mean a researcher is going to be able to find that data. And if that researcher could find that data, it doesn't necessarily mean that that researcher will have access to it. There are very valid reasons for access restrictions. Controlled access data is one example. There's also non-controlled access data, but that also can carry with it some access limitation for a researcher. But assuming that researcher can find and access that information, it doesn't mean that that data set will interoperate with another Common Fund program's data set that holds similar types of data. To weave those two together takes a lot of talent, and interoperability takes some time. But assuming the researcher can find, access, and interoperate on that data doesn't mean that that analysis would be able to be redone in the future. It doesn't mean that data could be reused necessarily by someone else in the same way in the future. That's the reusability that I was talking about. And largely this, and it's a bit of an oversimplification, but that's what the Common Fund data ecosystem, that awardee, Owen White, is sort of working toward. And then this third star, I want to really talk through the data coordinating centers. Fundamentally, we need the data. You need the experts involved in that data. But in order to enable interoperability, you need to have more than one data coordinating center participating. You have to have at least 2 to start this tango. So that's where the data coordinating centers come into play, and that's why what we're going to be asking you about today. Okay. So the goals of the the Common Fund data ecosystem, to make Common Fund data sets more useful alone and in combination with others, but along the way, we hope to also accomplish a few other goals. Betsy already mentioned some best practices for new programs. So imagine being able to provide a toolkit or a guidebook to new programs and say, if you do say these 10 things, that will help your data be useful 10, 20 years from now after that Common Fund program ends. It will also fundamentally enable us to ask scientific questions across the data sets. Betsy also mentioned it's really hard to do that now, if at all. That's one of our goals, and that's where use cases are going to come into play when we ask for your concept clearance. It will also help increase the reuse of data and tools after a program ends, and this gets to the sustainability part that we're going to discuss in a minute. But also incorporating old data into new programs. This is where the FAIR principles also come into play. Some of that old data was created years, decades ago, didn't necessarily contemplate a use beyond its time. So those are the goals of the Common Fund data ecosystem. And again, the cloud is only part of this solution. So the timeline that Vivian mentioned when she was here discusses where we've been, where we are today, and where we hope to head. So she was here in May, and since that time, as Betsy mentioned, our ecosystem team has been very busy actually undertaking a critical assessment with 4 data coordinating centers, Kids First, GTEx, Microbiome, and Links, to obtain a deep understanding of what they need in order to have their scientific data set more useful alone and in combination with other data sets. And they provided a report of their progress. So today, I'm going to provide you with an update on that report, which is actually foundational to our concept. And then beyond today, what the Common Fund Data Ecosystem awardees have been working on is rounding out their initial set of assessments with additional data coordinating centers. But in addition, some of our next steps are actually dependent on what you decide to do with our concept. So let me provide you with some information to help inform your deliberations. The report was provided to us in July after the awardees had had some deep dives with 4 of our data coordinating centers. I'd like to acknowledge the authors, Titus Brown, Amanda Carbonell, Owen White, and of course the participating data coordinating centers, and again, there were 4 of them. Okay, what NIH asked the awardees to do, and we asked them to actually do 2 things, and we got much more than that. So we asked them to do an initial scan of 9 data coordinating centers. So to look at information that was readily available either on the web or some other way, data type, size, storage, uses, users, use cases, available training resources, data access information. We also ran an initial fairness scan using the tool that Betsy had mentioned on those publicly accessible data sets. In addition, we asked them to touch base with as many data coordinating centers as they could in a pretty tight time frame. They were able to get to 4, and that was a really personal engagement, hours long, and some were 2 days long, and to actually walk through use cases. What do the end users use the data for? How do they consume it? What tools do they use? What training do they have available? What are some of the technical considerations as part of their data? Did they have any implications of cloud use? Human subjects concerns, FISMA, which is security-related authentication, data migration. But they offered much more than that. And the awardee, what they delivered was an additional part, which I think was some of the most compelling parts of the report, were the game changers. And the game changers, to me, were pretty exciting to read about. These were ideas that came up from the data coordinating centers when they were asked, what would you do if you could significantly advance science? How would you do something with your data set in order to make that happen? What would be needed to reduce some barriers and improve your capabilities? So that's what we got. And I'm going to go over the game changers for you because they were really pretty exciting. And again, the game changers fall into the 4 bins I mentioned earlier: infrastructure, collaboration, training, and sustainability. Infrastructure, I'm going to talk about cloud storage, but there's more involved in that. But cloud storage is necessary. It's not sufficient, but it's very important. We have 2 data sets at the moment that were actually scanned in this first analysis that aren't in the cloud. They're on local servers. So we have that to contend with. But no matter what, even if they were on the cloud, there's more infrastructure that's needed to make linkages between data. In collaboration, I broke up into a couple different areas. Collaboration from the people perspective is to get people in the same room to talk about the best practices, talk about the barriers and the challenges. Again, it takes at least 2 to tango when it comes to data set interoperability. The technical aspects of collaboration is also important. So the data coordinating centers that we spoke with very much wanted and were very motivated to have their data sets interoperate with other data sets. But there were going to be some real technical barriers to get to that point. Harmonization is an example. End user training was also raised as a common concern among the data coordinating centers. They all have end user training, but there aren't enough resources to actually answer all of the needs. So some of the needs are, how do you uncompress a file? There are other needs, such as having clinical researchers using bioinformatics tools, and then you have bioinformaticists trying to answer clinical questions. So end user training was a big need expressed by these groups, and they imagine that this need would get even bigger when their data sets are used more broadly and interoperating. So that was another need they had. And sustainability, and I'm glad it came up this time, and I know it came up in May, concerns over long-term viability of data sets. And so I'm going to just focus on that for a minute because it was a point made today and also on May. So sorry this picture is kind of tiny. I hope you can see it. But these are some select Common Fund programs with their beginning dates shown and their natural end date over here. So we're basically here at the 2020, if that's pointing where I think it's pointing. So we have HMP, which has ended already. That's the one that the servers are due to be decommissioned in the wintertime. Links has only a few more months of funding, and then we have others that are going to follow. But in terms of sustainability models, if anyone does software development here or actually runs a program like that, software development tends to follow a life cycle approach. In a life cycle approach, there are different models to that. Some models are from the planning phase of development to operations and maintenance, but the more comprehensive models for software development extend way to disposition. And so when you decommission a product, what's going to happen to the resources that you collected? And so the thought was a sustainability model for data that follows a birth to grave sustainability life cycle model. And so that was the thought, but there are different roles for people in this. So the Common Fund data ecosystem folks propose that if upfront a new program could have, say, 10 things they could do to make their data sustainable in the long run, what would those 10 things look like? It could be how to store the data, how to describe the data, so it made sense going forward. And then at the end, if there's a different stewardship model that needs to be followed, then they can do that and might make it more simple. So that was, sorry about the long emphasis on sustainability, but I did want to make sure I covered that because it was a big emphasis in the report. So the report had 5 recommendations. I'm going to go over 2 of those more in depth because they're the foundation of the concept. The 2 that I want to cover are the DCC's needed investment for itself and then also to participate in the Common Fund data ecosystem. It's a cross sort of talking effort. So individually, the data coordinating centers end of life cycle support. That's one of the things that came up in the report. And as I mentioned before, we have 2 that aren't even in a cloud environment. Funding and opportunities to participate in this ecosystem. GTEx was one of those participants. But funding them to provide additional information would be helpful. In addition, they were all interested in targeted training opportunities. We saw some training opportunities that actually were cross-cutting. So we'd be interested in that as well. As far as the cross-DCC investment goes, the thought was to have DCCs engage in joint exercises where they propose a plan for how they're going to make their data sets interoperable. And so that cross-DCC investment was one area we were hoping to get feedback on today. That investment would also include interoperation between data sets and other collaboration opportunities, but also infrastructure reuse with tools. And the report included 3 additional recommendations. These are more technical activities that the ecosystem has been working on. These are metadata, fairness, engagement with other data coordinating centers. They're also looking for these transformative activities. Authentication and authorization is one of those. Okay. So that long-winded introduction brings me to the concept that we wanted to introduce today. My mic is off. Did I do something? He says I'm good. Can you hear me? I don't think I'm good. Okay, he says he has it right. Is that any better? Okay, sorry. Okay, so the concept is targeted needs at Common Fund data coordinating centers to establish the Common Fund data ecosystem. Again, this is that 3rd star in the alignment that we need. The goal would be to support the data coordinating centers on the things that we just talked about, to expand the science that can be conducted with their data set alone and in combination with another data set. The thought is it would be a very targeted, limited competition open to Common Fund data coordinating centers so that they can engage more fully with the Common Fund data ecosystem. And we were thinking the initial duration would be for 3 years, and after that time, come back. But we expect to resolicit applications if there are new programs that go forward. The budgets are expected to vary. Naturally, we're not quite sure what they'll come in looking like, but they're estimated at $250,000 per year per award. So that is the concept we're interested in today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Laura. Our 2 discussants are, again, Kevin and Terry. So, Kevin, you want to start? Thank you.
Sure, thank you. This is Kevin Johnson from Vanderbilt. I think that the concept of trying to get the DCCs to work together theoretically certainly is very exciting, and I have a reasonably high degree of enthusiasm for this, although a teeny bit of skepticism. And my skepticism begins, I think, with Garrison Keillor and Lake Wobegon, where all data coordinating centers are above average. That was a joke. And I think the thought is that I'm not completely sure I know how good they are at this, because I don't know if they were designed as data coordinating centers to think about interoperability. They were probably designed for other things. I was looking to find out who was actually in the CFDECC to see whether their oversight would add strength to what the data coordinating centers might be bringing in. So I think the challenge in this one is going to be, we can approve the concept, but I think the challenge is going to be selecting data coordinating centers that have truly driving problems that would warrant the level of interoperability that the coordinating center for the ecosystem would agree is important, if you follow that. It's a little bit complex, but interoperability for interoperability's sake may actually not get us anywhere. It's all about which model, which data elements they've decided to standardize, what they decided to standardize them on, and for what purpose. Because you're essentially talking about not just a secondary use of their data, but potentially tertiary and quaternary uses as you do this, right? So that's a large concern, but I don't know how to solve it without trying this. And I think that this could just be very high risk, high reward work for the amount of money that you're putting in. I don't think it's that much money. That was my really only concern. I like the concept. I was just not completely sure I knew what the DCCs would actually do and how we would make sure that that actually moves us forward in a way that's scalable.
Okay, thank you very much. Terry?
Okay, I agree with what David said. Star one seems data management, and a lot of that is occurring in many different places. It is the data coordinating centers that are critical, and is the focus really on NIH data commons, or is this spread out to other institutions? That wasn't clear to me.
It's Common Fund data coordinating centers that we're trying to loop into this. Is that, were you asking what the scope?
Yeah.
Like, yeah. So we're we're wanting to work with common fund data sets really as in thinking that this would may be useful and extrapolatable more broadly, but at the moment, this is a focus on common fund data.
I agree with David in the sense that I think we absolutely have to do this. And I know some of the data coordinating centers and how active they are and what they're bringing to the table. And I do think there will be some good things that come out of it. If it isn't, we're going to have a bunch of data sets that we can't do anything about. So, I mean, this is risk and cutting edge, and we need to do it.
I would just add that, so part of what we're trying to understand is which of our data coordinating centers want to be involved in this. And so it may be that those that really don't see themselves as working in this space may not submit a plan. So we're going to be asking for plans from our data coordinating centers. What do you think the opportunities are for your data to interoperate with other common fund data sets? What do you think the challenges are? What are your needs that may be specific to your data set, but also that may be in common? So we are asking for it's sort of an opt-in approach for the data coordinating centers, and then we'll have a review of this. So if they put together a plan that's not very compelling, that will presumably come out in review.
Okay, let's open it up for discussion. Why don't we'll go around this way and keep going until we're out of questions. So Rick, you're first. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I reviewed the concept last time with Andy, and the reservations that Kevin brought up were exactly what was there in the first place. It's just not clear what's going to happen and whether it needs to be centralized or not. It just seems like a centralized effort to bring this together might be a little bit more useful than having the data centers try to anticipate what the interoperability with others are by contacting them, and more importantly, what the user groups on the outside that they haven't anticipated are and how they might interact. So I think the idea that we need to do this is really great. I'm just trying to wrestle with, is this going to do what it's supposed to do or not? And I'm not sure.
Good. Yes, Chris.
Sorry, I'm one of the DCCs, so I can't really, but I can shed some light on here, which is if we go back to the original pilot project, I think the concerns you've had were very well founded, and they were our concerns too, was that we brought all this sort of outside effort in. The data sets there were not necessarily common fund, these are restricted here, but they were arbitrary data sets in a sense, and some gelled, some didn't, but we actually had no driving scientific need to address a lot of the things that we were trying to address in that pilot project. And as a data center and as a group of scientists who understand our data, we kept saying, hang on, that doesn't make sense, that doesn't make sense, that doesn't make sense. And then the next meeting, we'd say the same thing. So this actually was a step back from that, an acknowledgement that you're right, what's the point of harmonizing this data or trying to interoperate between that? And as, you know, as these guys said, they came to speak to several of the data centers. Each of us said, you know, what are your limitations? Sustainability is a huge limitation, but is interoperability useful? And absolutely, we know our users want it. I know my user community better than anything else. I've got 10,000 of them, and they shoot questions at us every day. And we've got software engineers, bioinformaticians, and myself answering those. And you know, the thing we came to was, okay, if we're limited to the scope of the common fund data sets, what does this interoperability mean? Are there things you'd like to interoperate with? And the answer is absolutely yes. There are some of these where the common fund is so diverse, it doesn't make sense to me right now. And I'll say, no, not that one, not that one. But these three, where it's my understanding we have the same types of data, and they're probably very, you know, non-interoperable right now, would be very useful. I'm not resourced to do that, but if I had a little resources, and if that center had resources, and I know that this one coming down the line has very similar data, we could absolutely achieve these types of goals and do that. We're resource limited to do it right now. A lot of us have very similar data types, but I don't know what their data types are, how many there are, what the circumstances are. So if there's another DCC willing to step up to the table with a data set I think is interesting, we could absolutely forge that forward because we understand those better than anything else. So I do think this ground-up approach has the best opportunity of succeeding and pushing forward. And many of us said, okay, we don't need to harmonize X, Y, and Z, but if I want to analyze the expression data from kids who are first with GTEx, I can already tell you that I know that they're on different gene models and mapping those genes is going to be a pain. So let's take the basis of what we need to do and take those steps forward. So I just want to say that it's a little bit different than the former approaches, and this was very much a grounds-up approach to, okay, let's step back and say, how do we get there?
Can I ask a question? So do you think this can be accomplished with the set of common fund programs we have now? Or do you think we should look at one common fund program and say there's 20 in the institutes that it needs to be connected to? Because our issue here was partly a stewardship for our common fund investments as opposed to solving this problem for everybody.
I think it's both.
Okay.
I think limiting it to I mean, with sort of this amount of funding, we could pick a couple that are common fund, across common fund and make that work. But I can already tell you in terms of interoperability, and maybe, Andy would say the same thing, the data set that we have in GTEx, TopMed was a good choice. ENCODE and Roadmap are another good choice. There are some that are out there in the other institutes. But within common fund, Kids First, MotorPack, have sort of similar areas as well and similar types of questions. So it's not a bad starting point.
So that is incredibly helpful, and I think missing from the presentation. I mean, what I'm now hearing is that there is a network of known potential synergies, and I'm wondering whether the concept could be changed. The concept is the same, but whether the funding strategy could be changed to leverage those. In other words, it's not one DCC, it's two DCCs, but there's some team science way in which they need to apply to demonstrate what they'd like to do together, versus we're really interested and we're really good, and we're really interested and we're really good, but our data sets actually will never have a reason to talk together. So you know what I mean? So there may be a strategy here that's different, that forces the DCCs to do work to get the money as a group, as opposed to as an individual.
I have no background in this, so my question might not even make sense. But long-term, is this something that could be applied across the NIHs? For instance, NCATS has a data coordinating center for their RDCRN, which is contracted out, and they're also using the cloud. And if so, is this something that long-term there would be mandates, like they did with the Smart IRB? In order to get funding, you need to use X or X, Y, and Z. I'm just trying to I know this, you're trying to figure out what's going to work now, but I'm trying to see where it's going.
So I think the work that we are trying to do with common fund data sets is happening across the NIH. And so we are trying to figure out how best to move forward with our data sets. NCI is doing the same. Each IC is doing their own thing. We are collaborating with other ICs to try to move down the field together. And so probably ultimately at some point there will be some NIH-wide either policies or best practices that the NIH will say, we've tested a lot of things, here's what we want to be the sort of the standard best practice. I don't know whether it will come from the Common Fund data ecosystem. I expect that we will contribute to that through this effort. But the establishment of sort of mandates of you must do it this way or you won't get funding, we are certainly not in a position to do that. Maybe somebody at the NIH will take that on. It's a pretty heavy-handed way to do things.
So I love the idea of this. I mean, explicitly, you know, as you described, its purpose is for translation, to get this out to the community and stimulate new ideas and so forth. But I think as it's written, it's a little bit too insular. So it's the DCCs talking to each other, and it's open to the DCCs. And as wonderful as they are, and as difficult a job as it is, and sort of unsung hero-ness or something about it, there are some problems. I think, for example, people might want to get access to data, users from the DCCs, but the data under the data, like sequence data and so forth, that they might want to then directly access, it's often not available to people who aren't the primary grantees in those common fund supported programs or the DCCs themselves. And offline, I can give you examples of this. It's in several different programs. And so I think improving the portability and accessibility of data to outside people is important. That's number one suggestion. Number two, I mean, that should be part of it. Number two is, I think, involving users who aren't in that community already, getting their input, maybe their participation in any initiatives that come out is important because they're going to see things in a very different way. Like, for example, as the new imaging, I forget the name, I can't remember these acronyms, but the new one with slides and so forth and tissues, the next GTEx, whatever it's called. We're going to hear about it later. Yeah. But there are going to be people who are thinking about getting involved in that. And then maybe some of those people should be able to compete or get involved in these programs. And the third is that there are data scientists who come from an unconventional angle. We should be always thinking about innovative people who aren't already in our portfolio, like physicists, physicists who deal with astronomical databases, who have gotten involved in big data, genomics level, or information theory type people who have a very different perspective on how you put data together. And they may have bad or good ideas, but as this is crafted, I think that should be involved. So my biggest concern about this is that it's specifically looks like it's for DCCs to figure out a way to communicate and talk to each other, and I just think it's a little insular, as wonderful as they are. And I mean, I have such admiration for what they do, friends with their directors mostly, all of them that I know, so and I appreciate it very much. But just thinking from our council point of view, I think it's a little insular.
Okay, so a couple of strong messages that I've been hearing is to be very strategic about which DCCs participate in this project so that there's a value for them working together and it wasn't just an exercise. You know this. It's not an exercise just to interoperate for no purpose. And another is make sure that it's not focused on just getting them to work with each other, but to work together so that others can have greater access and use for the data, which I know is in there, but maybe folks didn't hear that emphasized.
We didn't really go through all of the activities of the Common Fund Data Ecosystem Coordinating Center, which is an award that's already in place. And that coordinating center is the group that has been doing the effort that produced this July report. They're the ones that have been reaching out to the data coordinating centers to sort of figure out what needs to be done. And they had that effort has a significant outreach component to try to engage the user community more, which I think might address some of your issues. So that award is structured to be pretty flexible to bring in new capabilities as we identify them, essentially.
Right. Yeah, one of our other challenges is that there's the approaches to data storage, management, and use. They're being developed by hundreds of programs simultaneously that aren't talking to each other. So this is an effort that's focused on the ones that we know the best. They're trans-NIH efforts. And we hope from this we can learn something that's applicable to everybody else, applicable to future Common Fund programs, and also creates more value for our Common Fund data sets. So I understand completely the issue of this looks too focused, but this is a tough environment to work in. So here's where we were proposing to start for a Common Fund effort. So, yeah, please.
This beyond the common fund movement, it's broader. And I certainly appreciate your comment that and also everybody else is probably doing the same thing.
Or different things, that's the problem.
Well, that's the problem. It has the same intent. So one of the suggestions might be to intentionally, really around this area, engage colleagues that NIH. This is a trans NIH effort. NHLBI what's the drive on working within NIH so that people learn best practices from each other and sort of accelerate the development of this rather than doing it in an insular way. Now we've got a great way for the PCCs to talk to each other. They can't talk to anybody else because they set up their own mechanism.
That's a fantastic comment. I see that as a principal role of the Office of Data Science Strategy. So they're really in a good position to bring together people across the NIH who are doing similar things like this. And there is a working group that Susan Gregorick runs that meets to begin to work through how different components of the NIH are approaching different aspects of FAIR, where are there opportunities to collaborate. So it is very complex. There are so many moving parts, but I feel like there is a strategy to collaborate and work together. We don't want to be another silo.
Yeah, our next speaker is Dr. Gregorick, who is the special advisor for our Office of Data Science Strategy, and she's charged with implementing the strategic plan for data science that includes efforts to integrate all these activities. And she has a pretty effective group of people from all the institutes working towards that. It's a challenge, but that's not what this particular proposal is attempting to do.
Oh, sure, I understand that completely. But this is an opportunity.
Oh, yes, and this group interacts with all the others in the institutes.
What is the thought around who's defining the spec for the data types? Is that what the applicants are defining, and therefore the review process is saying, did you pick the right things? Or is this existing award that is for the coordinating center amongst the coordinating centers, are they defining these are the data types we have determined through our outreach and discussion with the community are necessary for integration? Because I think that's a big part of some of the discomfort you hear is right now it feels like integration for the sake of integration. You know what needs to be integrated very well, but reaching out to people that aren't in that circle of trust right now and figure that out. If a disinterested party is involved in that, I think there'd be a little bit more enthusiasm, given especially that these are actually pretty small awards. We're talking about 2, maybe 3 FTEs. So there's got to be somebody else is doing a ton of homework that 2 or 3 FTEs are actually executing on. Who's coming up with the homework of what needs to be done?
We're in this initiative, we're asking for the data coordinating centers to do that. No, they haven't done it yet.
No.
Right.
So heard all your comments, excellent comments that can be incorporated into how this actually gets done. Are you ready to take a vote to approve the program, the concept? This is one we'll bring back to you periodically just to tell you how are we doing with this.
Is there any enthusiasm for revision?
What would the proposal be?
Well, I think there's been a lot of ideas. Somehow there's an argument for something more
Centralized.
It's a small amount of money. You're going to get something happen. I think that I am not convinced it's going to move any dial when there's an opportunity to have a real impact here. So that's just my own view. So I might be the only one that feels that way. I felt that way the last time, and I was the only one. So I still might be the only one. I'm willing to stand out.
I'd have to say that that's very challenging to do because it's a matter of coordinating lots of different people who are doing their research in real time and saying.
But that's exactly what the problem is we're trying to address.
We
So
acknowledge that.
I should say that the intent is for the coordinating centers to come forth with their ideas. We have a standing entity that will coordinate amongst them once we have a group of the willing of the data coordinating centers. So the structure that we've put in place is what we're referring to it as the ecosystem. So we need the data coordinating centers to be part of this ecosystem, or there's nothing to build here. So I think that we intend to have flexibility in the awards so that there can be adaptation after the group gets together. Once they think together about what this ecosystem should look like, what the opportunities are for collaboration between the different data coordinating centers. So this, the crux of this is the crux of the concept is to engage the data coordinating centers to build this ecosystem. And we are rather purposefully vague about the details of what that needs to look like because we need to hear from the data coordinating centers. We're not really wanting to be directive about specs. We're not wanting to tell them what they must do. We're trying to bring them together for that.
I'd just add one last thing to that. That having been sort of involved in the prior effort, which really was what you're suggesting, Rick, in a sense, right. Yes. It was too big, too ambitious, and too many stakeholders already far apart. And I think the reason that this is likely to be more successful is it's because it's reduced in scope and it's gone from the sort of ground level to say, okay, we want to get there. These data have to be in the cloud. They have to be findable, like Andy said. They have to be available, and interoperable. And how do I know what's there? Right now, it's really hard. The bigger the data sets get, the more difficult they are to find. And I think taking just a couple of these where they're willing to work together to start with, and they're at least within the same sort of entity, is a way to move forward and show that. When we tried it top-down last time, it was really difficult, and it still needs to happen. But I think we need to get there, absolutely.
And our process for approaching the general problem is something that's been assigned to another office.
But you can't, I mean, can you work with that office?
I shouldn't
or
have said it
could this
that
be
way.
under their surveillance so
Susan,
that it really happens?
Are you aware of this program, Susan?
And what role are you going to play in it? So if your office is part of this and playing an active role in this, then that's encouraging.
Part of this is sociology, as getting people to work together, and the Common Fund centers are more likely to play together.
So
We had, let's finish up with it.
yeah, but I have to say, I'm actually with you with a major issue. I really am, as long as it says from CFDCCs. I really have a problem with that, unless that's modified in a meaningful way, that obviously the DCCs have to be involved, they'll probably lead them, but that really has to include in the proposals that come in some additional voices from users and from and maybe even data scientists who are independent, who can bring a fresh look and a breath of air into it. And then I'm okay.
That's
something we can accommodate?
Yeah, we can certainly
build
ask
it
in
for
the
use.
applications for the DCCs to talk about their users, how they will engage users, and what data science expertise they might bring into this.
I think what Kevin is trying to phrase, and many of us feel, is there's a huge user pool out there that aren't in these centers right now that you can't anticipate in the standardization of the data across and the input from a broader perspective of communities could make a real difference. Is that fair, Andy?
I'm hearing that comment. And so, I mean, we are very interested in engaging the user community. We can't engage them in this award process as direct awardees. And so we need to have a structure for our data centers to work together with our coordinating entity, which includes an outreach component. I think that's really the only way that we could address that. But the users must have an active role in this. I agree with that. Kristen?
This has been incredibly useful discussion, and the team will incorporate these thoughts, and we'll give you an update on how this is doing, maybe in a year. The awards will be out. We'll know what this looks like, if they approve it. So I'm going to ask, is there a motion to approve, accommodating your comments? Second. All in favor, say aye. All opposed?
Aye.
Patty?
Aye.
Thank you. And opposed? Abstentions? Yes, thank you very much. Okay, so this is passed, and it's a challenge. This is a space where we need to do some work, and this is a pilot, and we'll bring it back to you.
Absolutely. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
those comments.